We have two wonderful speakers today. Dennis Hanratty, to my right, the Executive Director of Mount Vernon United Tenants. And Mr. Hanratty is well known throughout New York State for all the work that he does on behalf of tenants. One person I want to recognize here, Brittany Muller. Brittany is from Washingtonville Housing Association in Mamaroneck. And she has a job just like my job, and she came here today to listen to the workshop to get an idea of what my responsibilities are and how I work with my consumers. So welcome. Okay, Mr. Hanratty, you're on first.
Okay, should I go here?
Right there at the mic, sure.
Okay, sure.
Can everybody hear me? I probably don't even need that. I have a pretty loud voice. But I want to thank Udomi for inviting me, one of my favorite organizations in Westchester County, Udomi. And I didn't realize you're from Washingtonville Housing Alliance, one of the 6 agencies like myself that gets funded under the statewide neighborhood preservation program. And Washingtonville Housing Alliance is near and dear to my heart because I met my wife through Washingtonville Housing Alliance. She used to be the assistant director there. And actually we met in Albany in a lobbying visit. I used to organize the Westchester delegation every year, and my wife didn't come up on the bus with us because she was going to school down at Lehman College at the time, so she had to drive up, and she gets to one of the lobby meetings, and she goes, "Who's this guy with this big mouth talking about all this stuff?" But one thing happened after another, and we eventually got married, kind of merged Washingtonville Housing Alliance and Mount Vernon United Tenants. So Washington is very near to my heart, obviously. I think I'm just going to have this thing be kind of open-ended, but I did want to talk about a couple key things. The biggest effort that we're working on right now, you'll see there's a rally next Thursday night in New York City, and then there's also a staple piece, rent protection laws expire in 2 months, what comes next? That's from back in April. The state rent laws that protect people who live in multifamily buildings. There's 4 laws in New York State. There's New York City rent control, there's New York City rent stabilization, then there's New York State rent control, which covers some units here in Westchester, and then most of the people, some 30,000 units are covered under what's called the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, generically known as rent stabilization. Don't worry, it's not listed on those things, but it was that.
Program.
What's that?
It's in my program.
Okay, it's in her program. Rent stabilization is the actual name of the law in New York City, but in Westchester, in Rockland and Nassau, it's the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, the ETPA of 1974. That law provides rent and eviction protections to tenants who live in buildings with 6 or more units that were built before January 1st, 1974, privately owned buildings, okay? And there's 18 communities in Westchester that are covered on it for years. My organization, Mount Vernon United Tenants, brought 2 additional communities in the last 5 years. We brought Croton-on-Hudson in and the city of Rye, both targeted at 1 building apiece, though. Large buildings where tenants were being harassed, and we were invited in in Croton, we were invited in by some of the residents and some of the, not the city officials, but some of community activists. And then in Rye, I was actually invited in by the then mayor, Steve Otis, who's now a state legislator, state assemblyman for that district. And in both cases, we were successful, got the cities to opt into the state rent law. Those rent laws, those 4 laws that I just mentioned, all expire midnight, June 15th. Okay, and these laws are, like I say, are rent and eviction laws. They prevent against unwarranted rent increases, and they guarantee tenure for the tenants. They have the rights to renew their leases. But those laws are all emergency laws. Rent control is the Emergency Housing Rent Control Law, and as I mentioned, ETPA is the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. They're all based upon the fact that there is a housing emergency in New York State, and that emergency is the fact that there's less than a 5% vacancy rate. The New York State Legislature has determined that a less than 5% vacancy rate constitutes a housing emergency. You know, to bring people back to their old high school or college economics courses, when you talk about supply and demand in basic economics, you have to have an adequate supply or else demand can be easily manipulated. Since there's not an adequate supply of housing, housing demand is easily manipulated. It's not like if you lose your apartment now, you have an apartment, let's say $700-800, your landlord's not giving you heat or hot water, you can say, I'm out of here. I'm gonna go get an apartment around the corner. Why can't you do that?
Because they don't exist.
Because they don't exist. There's not a demand, there's not a supply. If there's not an adequate supply, demand is easily manipulated. And that's what's happened. So there's not an adequate supply of affordable, dignified housing. So people are put into this situation and landlords have all the power. And so the state has instituted emergency laws to protect tenants who live in these buildings so they're not subject to landlord abuse. Those laws all expire midnight June 15th of this year. They were last renewed in 2003 for 8 years. So they expire in a month and a half. Well, they're going to get renewed, but the problem is, how are they going to get renewed? Are they going to get renewed as is, which is terrible if it happens, or can we strengthen it? Because what's happened in the last, say, 20 years, we've lost approximately 400,000 to 500,000 units of affordable housing under the rent laws, mostly in Manhattan, but throughout the 5 boroughs, and we're starting to lose them up here through a mechanism called high rent vacancy deregulation. In 1997, does anybody remember 1997, Senator Joe Bruno?
Yes.
Senator Joe Bruno said he was going to do away with rent control as we know it. And during that campaign, he held up the state budget. That was the latest state budget of all time until that time, because it was a battle about renewing the rent laws. Right across the street from here, Senator Nick Spano had an office. We were out here having rallies in front of his office on a regular basis during that time, during 1997. However, the laws were eventually renewed in 1997, despite Senator Bruno's pledge, but they were seriously, seriously weakened. And some of these weakening amendments were these high rent vacancy decontrol, 20% vacancy bonus when apartments when they turned over, incentivizing landlords to try to chase tenants out so they could raise rents. The laws were then renewed from 1997 for 6 years to 2003, at which time there was some further weakening amendments. In 2003, they were renewed for 8 years to 2011. And what happened in 2011, we didn't get any more weakening amendments, thank God, and we got one incremental improvement. One of the things that happened in 1997, like I said, if an apartment got to reach $2,000 and it was vacant, it was no longer subject to the laws. So this was an open invitation to landlords to start raising rents legally or illegally. Especially in New York City, you couldn't find another vacant apartment that was under rent stabilization. They were all decontrolled, basically. I remember Senator Spano and Senator Villela, the 2 Republican senators who were representing Westchester at that time, kept on telling me, oh, Dennis, don't worry about this. This is a Manhattan thing. It's not going to affect us up in here in Westchester, because our rents were here maybe $500, $600, $700, $800 at that time. $2,000 was a far cry. But I told them, I said, listen, it's very, very easy to start raising the rents. Now, I use a simple example. When that law was passed in 1997, said the rents, if it was $2,000 upon vacancy, it was no longer subject to the law. Now let's say Joe Brown over here is renting an apartment for $1,000. He moves out. That's a long way from $2,000. However, like I say, that law in 1997 gave this 20% vacancy bonus. So all of a sudden that $1,000 rent now is $1,200. Now how does the rent get from $1,200 to $2,000? Well, very simply, there's also a mechanism in the law where landlords can raise rents on vacant apartments if they come in and do work on it. They come in and you'll see most apartments that are rent stabilized, when they become vacant, you'll see new kitchens and new bathrooms be put on. Because the landlords can raise the rent then 1/40 of whatever money they invest. So the landlord started thinking, wow, I've got the rent from $1,000, now it's $1,200. How much do I have to, what kind of work do I have to do to get it to $2,000? And the magic figure there, I just use that $1,000 because it's kind of a neat figure, is $32,000. You do $32,000 worth of work, and you're entitled to an $800 increase. So now the rent's $2,000, and it's no longer subject to the regulations. And the kicker in all this is the landlords didn't even have to apply for that stuff. And the state didn't investigate it. It was only if an incoming tenant challenged it. And most incoming tenants, for the one part, aren't even aware of their rights. Secondly, That's usually the farthest thing from their mind, that they're gonna start challenging them. Usually they're so happy to have a roof over their head, they're not gonna start thinking about how they can start suing the landlord or whatever. So and what happened also in 1997, they limited the time. It used to be if you thought you were being overcharged, you could file administrative complaints and you can go back as far as you can. They limited in 1997, you couldn't go back more than 4 years. Anything more than 4 years, you were time barred from challenging. So a lot of rents that were illegal became legal rents improperly. So all these forces were combining to put upward pressure on rents. Now, we help some people do overcharge complaints because there are some mechanisms, even if it went back more than 4 years. If it was a question of fraud, illegality, or irregularity, you could open up a case. And I got some people, pretty big, substantial sums of money, like over $30,000 in overcharge, so they live rent-free for a couple of years or stuff like that. But by and large, most people lost on that game. So there's been constant upward pressure on rents since then. And we've been in a real battle ever since 1997, trying to keep people in their homes. Mount Vernon United Tenants, we're the only non-New York City organization that's part of the steering committee of one of the campaign to renew these laws and strengthen them, called the Real Rent Reform Campaign. We've been meeting for the last 4 years, since the laws were last renewed in 2011. We've been meeting in New York City with different groups trying to fight to get the laws not only renewed but strengthened, and most especially to remove the high rent vacancy deregulation. As I said, it was $2,000 from 1997 to 2011. Governor Cuomo likes to take credit for in 2011 as far as the renewal. They raised that threshold to $2,500, and he made it like that was a big deal for us, a big gift for us. The only thing I thought it was a negative, because that was just to further incentivize the landlords to raise rent even further. So maybe some didn't get decontrolled right away, but more and more units are being priced out of the range of most working class people here in Westchester County, which is our main issue. So what we want to do, we want to remove that target, that high rent vacancy decontrol target, so landlords aren't incentivized to try to start raising rents higher and higher and higher to reach this deal. I know in Mount Vernon, even in some of the, like in the middle of town, the Plaza Complex, which is not populated by rich people, just working class people, almost all of the units there are just like one vacancy away now from reaching that vacancy threshold. A lot of people are maybe only paying $1,400, $1,500, $1,600, but there's a function called preferential rents, some people may have heard. What's happened with all these decontrol mechanisms that have been instituted, some of the regulated rents have actually exceeded the market rents. So landlords can't even get those rents, even with the market. So maybe the legal regulated rent now is $2,100, but they'll rent it for $1,400. And so the tenants feel comfortable there. However, it used to be that you paid that preferential rent for the balance of your tenancy. Court case about 8 years ago determined that wasn't right, that rents upon renewal can go back to the legal regulated rent from the preferential rent. So let's say you've been paying a preferential rent of $1,200 for 8 years, but the legal rent is $2,000. When your lease gets renewed, the landlord can go from $1,200 to $2,000. So people get hit with these huge, huge increases. So that's a major thing that we're working on. That's probably the second thing, is to remove preferential rent abuse, remove the high rent vacancy threshold, and also to remove the 20% vacancy bonus get on vacant apartments. All of which are combining to put more and more upward pressures on the rents. Now, I also gave out, you'll see in pretty much all of the things in our mailing. I gave you our last mailing, the Real Rent Reform Campaign. If anybody wants to go, I gave you my cards also. We're organizing transport down next Thursday down to New York City. We're starting at Foley Square. People know that way downtown, Foley Square. We're going to have a rally in Foley Square. We're going to march across the Brooklyn Bridge, and then we're going to rally in Cadman Plaza in Brooklyn next Thursday evening from 5 till about 7, 8 o'clock. We're trying to make a big, big impression about how strong the tenant movement is, and how this is the #1 public policy issue that the state legislature has got to deal with in its closing 6 weeks of the legislative session. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody here about the stuff that's going on right now with the Senate Majority Leader getting arrested earlier this week, and how that's going to throw the whole legislative process into a tizzy, so we're not really sure exactly how that's going to play out. We think it's good from the tenant movement because he's been a real problem, Senator Dean Skelos. Even he represents Rockville Center, and he's got very, very few rent-regulated tenants, but he's decidedly pro-landlord, and a lot of the Republican senators do get a lot of landlord real estate money. So they really want to do away with the laws or make the laws less effective. And I think it's a consensus among the real estate community. If the laws just get renewed as they are, they're going to wither away on their own. Because like I said, we've lost 400,000 to 500,000 units, mostly in New York City over the last 20 years, and we're losing, thousands every year through this high rent vacancy decontrol. So unless we can stanch that, we're, running this rear guard action. So we've got to really change the law to remove that target on the tenant movement's back. Other stuff that Mount Vernon, we work on policy issues like this, but probably the greatest amount of work we do is on eviction prevention. We run a homelessness prevention program. We stop about 150 evictions a year. We do it through a variety of administrative and/or judicial means. We work closely with legal services. They have an office in Mount Vernon. They also have one in Yonkers. They have one in White Plains. And we work very, very closely. Usually the Mount Vernon office, they usually have a staff person come in our office once a week doing intakes and stuff like that. I was on with the managing attorney earlier today. We have a new kind of campaign going on in Mount Vernon. People may have heard of the Wartburg Home, a very, very nice senior citizen place and disabled place. But there's a new senior citizen building there that they just constructed, and it was just opened up 2 years ago. And we helped get some people in there. And the administration is some questionable people. I think that at least their behavior is, people just moved into a senior building, they signed their first lease and they're refusing to renew leases. Can you imagine that senior citizen move into a senior citizen building and then the management says they're not going to renew their leases? People figure this is the last stop in my residencies and stuff like that. So we're fighting with legal services on that. We're developing both a legal strategy to defend these people and the political strategy, because I'm going to really go after the people at the Wartburg on this. I mean, you move people into a senior building and then a year later you tell them you're not going to renew their lease. I mean, it's just outrageous. But so we get involved in all kinds of campaigns like that. But like I say, the main efforts that we do is our eviction prevention work. Because the rents are so high, people are spending such a high percentage of their income, the slightest thing happens in people's lives and they're behind the 8 ball. We get people coming to us day in, day out, they're behind in the rent. So what we try to do, we try to scratch around through the Department of Social Services, through the Bridge Fund, through a variety of other agencies that disperse money. We negotiate with landlords, try to make repayment plans. We help tenants develop what are called meritorious defenses when they go into court. Maybe they can get money off their rent. Tenants have a right through a court proceeding to countersue landlords. A landlord sues you, let's say your rent's $1,200 and you didn't pay rent for 3 months. The landlord sues you for $3,600. You have the right in court, if you weren't getting all your services, to countersue the landlord. Whether you responded to the first notice you got, you still have the right in court to challenge that rent. The judge always asks tenants in any kind of non-payment proceedings, the judge reads the petition and says, the landlord claims you owe rent in the amount of blank, blank, blank. Do you owe that? And I tell the tenants, especially if they've got issues with their services, say, I don't believe so, Your Honor. And then list what you say are the problems in the building, or in your apartment specifically, perhaps in the common areas as well. And with the court usually has a couple of options there. Tenants invariably are unrepresented in court. I mean, maybe 5% times they have an attorney, but the great majority of the time they're not. Landlords are always represented by attorneys, so and they bring these charges against them, they owe this money. Tenants aren't represented. Most judges are attorneys, so there's kind of a kinship there with the landlord's attorneys. They know each other, they know the language and stuff. Tenants very often can be intimidated by the whole court proceedings. So sometimes it's difficult to get their position out, and sometimes some judges are better than others helping the tenants. The judges are not supposed to advocate for them, but they should at least let them know what the procedures are. We try to, I'm not an attorney, but I know the system. I've been doing this for 100 years now. So we tell the tenants what to do and stuff, but still tenants get intimidated in the court proceeding. The judges up there in their robe and stuff like that. It can be very intimidating, and like I say, the landlord's attorneys are very often bullies. They kind of try to railroad these things through the court. So sometimes the tenants have difficulty enunciating what their issues are. So I tell tenants is, make it as clear as possible what the problems are. And it's always better if the tenants have, contacted the landlord beforehand. If tenants open up intakes with us early, we help them write letters. It's always best to put things in black and white. Like tenants tell me, oh, the landlord knows about this problem. I said, that's not good enough. They're gonna deny it. Their attorney doesn't know this stuff anyway, and they're gonna deny stuff. You gotta build up a paper trail. Write letters, send those letters by certified mail. Send copies to me, send copies to the building department. Try to get documentation from the local code enforcement, from the building department, listing all those problems. So when you go to that first court proceeding, it's a hearing. Now, if you bring up a meritorious defense, the reason why you're not paying the rent, or why you don't think you owe all the rent, the judge can do a couple things. They can tell you to go outside in the hallway with the landlord's attorney and try to work out a deal. And maybe they'll give you a little bit of money off, and if that's the case, if you can work out a deal, then you think maybe I should get 20% off, but maybe you'll accept 10%, or maybe you think you're entitled to 50% off and you'll take 33. Maybe you can work something out. But if not, I tell the tenants, then you just say, I want to go to trial. And the court can't deny you that, okay? You come back, if you can't work out a deal with the landlord's attorney in the hallway, you come back and they put it back on. Because when you first get brought to court, that's just a hearing date. And when there's a dispute about a hearing, a judge can't resolve that at a hearing. If you guys can come up with a thing that you agree to, they can put that on the record, but they're not gonna litigate at a hearing. So they have to put that over for a trial a couple days later, or a week or two later, and that's when you get to produce your evidence. Okay, you go to the building department. There's usually three things. It's your testimony, pictures are always very valuable, and then letters or violations from the code enforcement office, be it the building department, the fire department, some kind of documented proof of what's the matter. Now, it's also helpful if you had previously written to the landlord about the problem. Let the landlord know beforehand, because very often landlords usually their attorneys very often have two arguments when tenants bring up these meritorious defenses in court. They say, oh, one, we didn't know about it. So the first thing is notice. You got to notify them about the problem. Or secondly, they often run this argument, oh, they didn't provide access. They wouldn't let us get in. They never let us. So I always tell tenants to write letters beforehand stating very clearly what the problem is and offering dates and times when the landlord can come in to do the repairs. Because like I say, their attorneys, usually the attorneys and the landlords rarely themselves come to court. Sometimes they will, but usually their attorney is. And their attorney doesn't know the dynamics of what's going on. All they know is the landlord hired them to sue you in court for a dollar figure. They don't know anything about the conditions and stuff by and large until they come to court and you present your defense. And so it's important that the tenant be clear on those things, even though it can be an intimidating proceeding, getting in front of a judge if you've never done it before. And it's just not a really good situation. All the cards are on the landlord's table on this thing. So we do a lot of work like that, assisting people to defend themselves. When tenants defend themselves, it's called a pro se defense. So they do pro se things, and we help people do pro se's orders to show cause. Have anybody heard that phrase, order to show cause?
Absolutely.
Yeah. An order to show cause is basically an appeal. When you already have a judgment against you, and normally when you get a 72-hour notice, that the marshal's gonna come within 72-hour notice, there is a proceeding called an order to show cause. And Legal Services of the Hudson Valley has prepared blank forms for every community in Westchester, so that at every court clerk's office, you may have them here, we have them in our office, most housing offices, housing agencies have those pro se forms. But you got to know what you're doing filling them out. Tenants can fill them out on their own, and if you have staff people who've done it, they should know how to do it. And I do trainings on how to do them and stuff, and the Legal Services will gladly do that as well. Because the Legal Services, the pro se order to show cause forms that are available in all the court clerks, they were all produced by Legal Services of the Hudson Valley. And like I said, there's those three offices in Westchester. If the people do have questions, they should ring them. Okay. We do a lot of building organizing. We have three main programs. Our homelessness prevention, where we stop eviction, we fight evictions through helping people do administrative cases like getting the money, or judicial cases like defense, meritorious defenses like I talked about. That's the biggest effort, our homelessness prevention. Then we do our tenant action project, where we organize tenants within individual buildings, letting them know their rights. And the biggest ones we're able to help are those tenants who live in stabilized buildings, because they have the rights. Very often tenants are afraid to get organized. Say, oh, if I say anything, or if I make a complaint, the landlord's gonna throw me out. The landlord cannot. Tenants have a right under Section 230 of the New York State Real Property Law, even under unregulated housing, tenants have the right to organize and to stand up for their rights so they don't get abused. Okay, people should know that they have that right. They have a right to meet in the common areas of their building at reasonable hours, and no landlord can infringe on that right. I've had landlords thrown out of their own buildings. I've called the cops on landlords and had them thrown out of their own buildings when they've tried to interfere on meetings and stuff like that. So people do have rights, but like I tell people when I'm organizing, I said, the rights aren't worth the paper they're written on if people don't know what they are and how to utilize them. Landlords will always try to intimidate you and let you think that you don't have those rights. So tenants have got to reach out, they've got to speak to my office, they've got to speak to legal services, they've got to get some kind of support like that. Don't let yourself or your tenants be bullied by landlords. The third program that we do is our policy advocacy. We work on a lot of different issues, renewing the state rent laws, working on welfare rights issues, all things that affect poor people in our community. Has anybody ever heard of the TPP? TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, okay? It's not a real landlord-tenant issue. It's a major trade deal. It's the big, people have heard of NAFTA, right?
Yes.
Everybody heard of NAFTA? TPP is what's called NAFTA on steroids. All right? We don't laugh because it's a dangerous, dangerous thing. In the mailing you'll see, we participated in a rally a couple of weeks ago. At that rally, even though nobody's heard about that, we've got both United States Congress people who represent Westchester, Nita Lowey and Elliot Engel came to that. The state senator from here in Yonkers, Andre Stewart Cousins, the Democratic leader, 3 state assembly people, Shelley Mayer from here, David Buchwald and Tom Abenanti from Washington, all were at that thing. 5 county legislators came, and the mayor of White Plains, Tom Roach, was all at our rally a couple of weeks ago on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a thing that's being done under the radar. There was no mention of this stuff in the press for years. This has been being negotiated in secret. It's an ugly, ugly, dangerous deal. So we've been working on that as well, if you want to read in the mailing. We try to work on all issues that affect people's income eligibility, income security in this country, in this county especially. We got an award last night, my organization, from the Martin Luther King Jr. Institute for Nonviolence. We were one of 3 agencies. Our agency, the Anti-Racist Alliance, and the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform were recognized for some of our work. And I was talking about the whole issue of housing insecurity and how it underlies, I believe, all other economic security issues. How when people are housing insecure, it really, really has a devastating impact on their lives. When people are worried about if the marshal's going to come next week or whatever, how can they function in their jobs? How can they function in school? How can they function in a community-based organization, a religious community? It just paralyzes people when people are worried about losing their home. I mean, a home is the most basic right that you have. All other rights, devolve from that. When people are housing insecure, as so many people are, when you're spending 50-60% of your income for rent, like I say, the slightest thing goes wrong in your life and you're behind the 8 ball. And the landlord's got you on the run. And it's just a horrible, horrible thing to see people, just unable to even sometimes get out of bed. People come to me at the last minute usually. I'm sure you guys get that sometimes when people come in 72 hours. How come you didn't come to me when you first got the notice of petition? But people get paralyzed by some of this stuff. So it's important, I think, that we always have these lines of communication open, talking to people about their rights and how they do have good rights and how to utilize those rights and identify resources that are out there that people can utilize in their efforts to stay in their homes and to maybe improve their housing situation. A lot of people, because the housing situation is so bad, all they hear about is homelessness, and they say, "There, but for the grace of God go I." They very often are quiet. They'll just accept bad conditions, and they don't have to. There are laws and regulations that protect people, but we've got to be demanding that those things are enforced. The laws are only as good as the enforcement of it. So we've got to know how to do that, how to file complaints, and how to follow up on those complaints. And if we're not getting a success on one level, who do we go above that? How do we go up that ladder to make sure our rights are being protected? I often ask when I organize tenant associations, I'm in a meeting, I ask people, I said, who here has made a donation of like $5,000 to a local politician? And I'll ask that to you. Anybody here? No. Well, you know, landlords do. Landlords make those all the time. Big, big donations, okay? And I tell people we can't compete on that playing field. But what we can do is we've got our collective action. And so we have to depend upon that. We have to talk to each other, educate each other, and work with each other to advance our interest. To educate ourselves about what our rights are and to expand those rights. Because there's always this whole dynamic going on, people trying to take our rights away. And if we're not in that game, if we're not in that battle, we're going to lose. Because the people who've got the money are making these side deals, they're making these deals under the table and stuff. And we can't do those kind of things. So we have to get out on the street, we have to go up to Albany for our lobby trips, we can lobby people in their district office here. So I'm on regular communication, with all the legislators. I testify for the Westchester County Rent Guidelines Board, I go to the Westchester County Board of Legislators, like on the TPP, we had a meeting. People know Ken Jenkins from here in Yonkers. He's used to be the chair of the county board, but now he's the chair of this one committee, the State and Foreign Affairs. And we made this presentation to them, this coalition is working on TPP. And even the county legislators, very few of them even knew what we were talking about. But they've educated themselves because some of the stuff, part of the TPP, it's really dangerous, is the question of just taking away our sovereignty. Because when some of these conditions are going to be raised in the TPP, they're going to be determined by unelected, unaccountable tribunals of 3 lawyers, all of whom are corporate lawyers, and they can sue the governments and overturn laws if they think it's going to hurt their future profits. So look up, I'm sure most people have computers now, Google the TPP and look at some of the stuff. Some really kind of Orwellian, ugly stuff. Like I say, we've been trying to educate our legislators, and we've been successful doing that. I said we made this presentation to the county board. 5 of those legislators came to this rally we had 2 weeks ago. So you can be effective in your lobbying and in your advocacy, and I think our agency has done that for a long time. I don't want to tell people how long I've been doing this to age myself, but if people get involved, like last night was a very, very inspiring event because people from 3 different agencies got recognized, but there was a lot of other agencies who were represented there. And it was the same thing about coalition building. How do we build coalitions to become effective advocates and to reach our goals and objectives? And you can only do that, like I say, because we don't have the money. We can't compete on the same playing field as some of the real estate interests and other high-powered interests, corporate interests. Our ability to impact public policy is through our collective action. And we're always looking to broaden that base. And so I've given my cards out. All people can feel free on individual tenant-related issues if they want to give me a call, or if they've got some specific issues that may be reflected in any of the handouts I gave you. Should I take questions now, or do you want to wait till the end of it? Or?
No, go ahead. Anybody have questions for Mr. Hanratty?
You first.
Go ahead, you want to ask a question?
No, you go ahead.
You obviously have a lot more experience than I do with dealing with legislators, policymakers, and politicians. Just as a person who has rented his whole life, 30 years ago, when the housing boom began, which crashed recently, in recent history, I kind of saw this coming 30 years ago, because I couldn't believe what they were trying to do 30 years ago. It just didn't make any sense, common sense wise. But I was younger and inexperienced. I see now how bad things have gotten, not just for individuals like myself, but I don't deal much with politicians like you do. And the question I guess I would like to ask you is, I want to make it not a yes or no question. Are the politicians so blind not just in New York or Westchester, but maybe in all over the country, whereby by excluding the citizens of that part of the world, don't they see what's coming, which is the, I don't want to say the end of society, because somebody will take over in the end, but I mean, in just 30 years, having been a Westchester resident my whole life, how shortchanged this part of the world, my part of the world,
Yeah.
Westchester County, has become. So I know that they must know, even if it's subconsciously. Do you hear anything in your dealings with them where, they may not be willing to admit, because like you say, money does some strange things to people, but do you see them like coming to a head with this? Because it's getting worse and worse. I think it's really the worst I've ever seen it.
Well, I agree. I think some of the conditions, the economic conditions, and it's not only here in New York State. It's not only here it's an international phenomenon.
It's pandemic now.
This growing divide between the haves and the have-nots.
The economy.
I mean, since the recession, 100% of there's been a lot of gains in productivity since the recession, but 100% of the increase in productivity has gone to the top 1%, not 90, 100%. It's this giant sucking sound.
They've excluded.
Yeah, exactly. And
The
I mean,
citizens
it's the
that
corporate
make up,
it's the corporate control. I was talking about this last night. It's the corporate control of our lives. I was wearing a T-shirt yesterday before I went up to the event. It says, "Don't trust the corporate media." It's a shirt by an organization called Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I don't know if people have ever heard of it, but it says, "Don't trust the corporate media." And I often wear it, and people start saying, like it's a trick question. What do you mean by that? I said, it's not a trick. I said, don't trust the corporate media. The corporate media is going to present a corporate-friendly message, okay? The corporations are controlling more and more of our lives. They dominate. People have heard of the Citizens United case, right? The Supreme Court case, which was just an aberration. Basically, people can give unlimited amounts of money, unaccountable, don't even have to say where it's coming from. As far as politicians, there's a couple things there. Politicians very often, you talk about the long-term interest. Politicians got short-term interest. They're looking toward the next election. That's what politicians all do. Politicians' main job is to get re-elected. Now, it all depends which kind. In local races, sometimes it's 4 years. State legislators every 2 years. So they're in a constant battle for election. So they're not always thinking about the long term. They are thinking about the short term. Now, I think in Westchester, we're blessed. I think we have a lot of good legislators. And I think a lot of them, like when we talked about the TPP, a lot of them were really, I think, honestly, really upset about this stuff. I mean, we did a meeting down in the Yonkers Public Library. Shelley Mayer spoke, Assemblywoman Shelley Mayer, State Senator George Latimer. I mean, they're really concerned about this whole sovereignty issue because you're going to have these unaccountable, unelected tribunals of 3 corporate lawyers making decisions in international tribunals that could undermine all the laws. New York State is going to pass an anti-fracking bill, okay? Theoretically, a company who signs on to the TPP, be it Vietnam is a real problem here, okay? They could sue New York State. If we pass an anti-fracking bill, they could, if they had some kind of industry that was going to work out of here and cause fracking, or needed fracking, they could sue New York State. In New York State, the anti-fracking bill would be null and void. They couldn't enforce it. So this whole stuff is this corporate control. They're going to even take away our democratic rights of sovereign nations to pass laws, be it a state law, be it a federal law, be it a county law. And like I said, the county legislators, 5 of them came to this meeting, 3 states, assembly people, and Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins. They're all upset. These are good politicians. They care. They're in this business really to pass good public policy. But they see the corporate control of our whole society now continually threatening even our rights, our sovereign rights to do these things. So I think some politicians do, but we have our only ability to compete against corporations and stuff is by our organized activity. And there's a lot of people working on this kind of stuff. So I encourage people to investigate on their own and online. You know, be careful about something. There's always a lot of crazy stuff. But go to people who you trust a little bit and try to get ideas and stuff like that. I'm always willing to give people direction on stuff like this too. I think a lot of politicians are good, but politicians by their very nature, they're thinking short term because they're thinking to the next election. So even though they may see stuff crumbling around them, and the economy is, I mean, all this stuff is this giant sucking sound. It's all going to the top. Everybody else is in a crumb fight.
It's out of control.
Yep.
Corporate control is no control.
Yep. Well, unless you're a corporate bigwig.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. Dennis?
Sure.
Are you ready?
Okay.
Have a seat, you can speak to Mr. Henry later if you have any other questions.